After 3 hearings, Meng Wanzhou, Chief Financial Officer of the Chinese tech giant Huawei, was released on a 10 million Canadian dollars bail, including 7 million in cash. This is the first development in her favor since her detention. Now, Justice William Erk of the Supreme Court of British Columbia, who presided over her bail hearing in Vancouver, set her bail and placed several other conditions, including surrendering her passports and restricting her activities to British Columbia. Meng will return to court in February for her extradition hearing. U.S. President Donald Trump, meanwhile, said on Tuesday, "If I think it's good for what will be certainly the largest trade deal ever made, which is a very important thing, what's good for national security, I would certainly intervene if I thought it was necessary." And China has also announced it will lower its tariff from imported U.S. cars from 40% to 15%. So what do these developments mean for Deng and for the trilateral relationship between China, the U.S. and Canada? Welcome to the third special edition of our series on the Huawei arrest case and all related or non-related issues from me and our team here in Beijing. And joining me in the discussion from Alberta, Canada via Skype is Professor Wenran Jiang, Senior Fellow at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia. In the Beijing studio by Professor Liu Guofu at the School of Law at Beijing Institute of Technology, and Edward Lehman, Senior Foreign Fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Later in the second half of the show, we'll be joined from Washington, D.C. by Eland, Senior Fellow at the Independent Institute. So welcome to all of the guests to the show. Let me go to Professor Wenran, Professor Jiang Wenran in Canada. Now, explain to us what kind of dilemma, what kind of situation does Canada find itself at this moment, and what are the discussions going on within your part of the world?
Well, the issue here is that Canada and the United States have a long-standing existing extradition treaty. This treaty means that either country, once requested by the other country with an extradition request for potentially violating the law of the other country, so the counterpart, after getting the request, has to make an arrest. In this case, we call it, of course, not arrest, but detention, temporary detention. And this is the case. That happens all the time. But normally, it is for other, criminal matters, escaped, criminals, etc. In this case, of course, it's high profile. Canada does not have much choice. Once the request came from the United States, Canada had to act on it. But it doesn't mean that she is convicted of anything. In this case, Ms. Meng of Huawei.
Well, what does this case how does this case stand out from other cases? You were saying that when the U.S. makes a request, the Canadian law enforcement authority has to arrest. What is different about this case with any previous cases? I mean, where you have an executive from a big Chinese corporation on transit in Canada, does that also make it one of the legitimate cases for Canada to go out and detain her?
Well, from a pure legal perspective, Canada doesn't really treat this one with any difference than others. It's an extradition request. Once that request came, you detain someone, and then you go through this kind of hearings that we have witnessed in the past few days. It's a very technical process to decide whether Ms. Meng is a so-called flight risk. And now they say all the conditions are met. She can be sending to her Vancouver home or homes. She has 2 houses there to stay. And the next stage is for the United States to submit the evidence for extradition, and they have up to 60 days. So the procedure simply plays out. The dilemma is that China feels Canada is conspiring, colluding with the United States for doing something damaging ties or helping the Americans on the trade war with China. Canada is actually in a rock and hard place, and it's not the case. They just simply have to carry out the procedure. And I think they could explain better to the Chinese side. So far, that has not seemed to be working out very well.
So does the Canadian do the different Canadian walks of life understand the kind of natural feelings that the Chinese, because from the information that they get, you know, it's natural that they feel very much upset. And, you know, according to the Chinese response, we have the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs has demanded that Canada immediately release Meng, and also for the U.S. to withdraw the extradition request and arrest warrant. Do the Canadians understand how the Chinese are feeling, and how do they plan to assuage that kind of concern or anger so that relations between the two countries are not put under greater distress?
Well, here I think the Canadians do understand, and they got a very severe warning. But as we discussed, this is really a dilemma for Canada. Canada does not do anything other than carrying out its treaty obligations. It's not an offense, as many Chinese public sees. It's simply carrying out a treaty duty, and ministers on the political side or the prime minister cannot tell the judicial branch what to do or even inquire into it. We have ministers had to resign for even inquire into some cases before. Therefore, the strict separation between three powers is very clear in this country. And I think the Chinese officials and the public in general should understand that process better. It may end up being the case that Ms. Meng's case is dismissed due to U.S. Lack of evidence when they submit to them. And therefore, I think the case here is more about China towards the United States. It shouldn't be China, you know, showing so much anger towards Canada. And I think we need to calm down and just explain to the general public how this all works, especially in the Canada case.
I understand. You're trying to explain to the Chinese audience here, or to the international audience, why the Chinese should not feel so upset. However, it's not just this one individual incident, let's say, because we've had the Article 32 in the new North American trade bloc, where Canada kind of surrenders part of its economic sovereignty to the United States by agreeing not to bilaterally enter into a free trade agreement with a non-market economy. If Canada does that, it has to inform the United States first, and then the trilateral trade agreement in North America has to be kind of cancelled. So Canada decided to side with the United States on that. This gave Beijing a big shock, and then I just want to play out this SOT, this SOT as well, because I was interviewing the Canadian ambassador to China, and he told me that Canada wants to diversify its trade and expand its trade with China. Let's listen to this also.
You know, we have a Department of Trade, a Ministry of Trade, and recently it changed its name, Ministry of Trade Diversification. So there's never been a better time to tell Canadians that now is the time to diversify our trade. We have so many eggs in one basket in terms of trade with the United States. Right. Something like 3/4 of our exports go to the United States. And so we clearly want to diversify, spread things out. And so the obvious candidate for primary diversification is China.
So from what the Canadian ambassador says and from what we see coming out of Canada, you know, these two things just don't seem to add up together. How realistic is it now for Canada to develop a healthy trade and prosperous trade relationship with China?
Well, we're looking at the situation that economically Canada has 75% trade dependency relationship with the United States. The Americans definitely forced that Article 32 on Canada during the trade negotiation, but Canada has turned around basically telling the Chinese they want to deepen trade ties with China anyways. It shouldn't be a major issue. I personally thought it was a sovereignty issue, but the Canadian government, current cabinet, has repeatedly assured the Chinese side it shouldn't be a major obstacle. I think it should be separated from the current extradition case, which is purely legal.
Okay, finally, let me ask you about the arrest of the former Canadian diplomat by the name of Michael Kovrig. China has said that he is arrested on Chinese soil because he's suspected of breaching Chinese law. How is that being seen in Canada, and how do you foresee that weighing on the situation on the Meng case, and is it adding or damaging China's political capital with Ottawa?
Well, I know you have other guests who will weigh in on this, but just very quickly, it's not well received in Canada at all. People feel this is an unnecessary tit-for-tat punishment of some sort. If we have this legal case going on, then the Chinese get angry and round up someone of a Canadian former diplomat, and therefore the initial response has been very negative. And I hope that is not the case, because in Canadians' cases, purely legal, and Ms. Meng may end up walking free. So let the process play out, not to escalate this. That's my advice to all sides.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Jiang Wenran, joining us from British Columbia, from Alberta, Canada, a professor with the University of British Columbia. Let me go to our guest here in the studio, Professor Liu Guofu from the School of Law at the Beijing Institute of Technology. What is your reaction to the arrest of Michael Kovrig? It is understood, as we heard from Professor Jiang, that this is Beijing's tit-for-tat retaliation against the detention of Meng Wanzhou. What is Beijing's explanation?
I think the arrest, Mr. Michael, is independent case. So I don't find such information which can prove its close links to the case of Ms. Meng. So China have promulgated the law of administration of activities of overseas NGO in China in 2016 and revised in 2017. According to this law, so the overseas NGO need to make a registration, then can operate according to this law.
So what's the problem with what, alleged problem with what Mr. Kovrig did?
So based information is released to the public, I understood. So ICG, International Crisis Group, so the Michael is in. So do not register according to this law. So if they do not register law, so the company cannot operate it legally. And
you mean the NGO cannot operate legally in China?
Yes, and also done in the employees of this NGO.
Okay.
Right, and I mean, just so you know that everyone in the NGO community, in our law firm, the law firm that I work at, has, in working with for a number of years, has represented many NGOs, and all of them, the first one to register under the new NGO law was the Paulson Institute. Jeffrey Paulson, who was the head of the Federal Reserve at one point in time, was among the first to do it, and all the NGOs knew of this. The government notified. They not only that, they asked the NGO community about input on the laws, policies, and regulations that were passed at the Lianghui. So this has been around for a long, long time. This is not necessarily tit for tat, but it's something that has gone on, and it's certainly someone who is in this so-called crisis institute should have known of this.
International Crisis Group.
Should have known of it. I mean, if they're solving these problems.
Are these two cases comparable? I mean, when you talk about tit for tat, what you want to do something that's of equal, I don't know, severity?
Not comparable at all. Only because one, I mean, this Michael, whatever his name is, from the NGO.
Michael Kovrig.
Yeah, he should have known and does know that he did not register properly. Okay, it has to be registered with the police. All this was notified. Second thing is, what was said earlier by the guest, I just want to be very clear. Canada has not had a decent separation between the judicial authorities and other parts of the executive.
How so?
For example, Justin Trudeau, there was a Canadian who wound up in a battle, wound up killing, was part of Al Qaeda or one of these extremist groups, a U.S. citizen, And not only when they were out was he pardoned, but he was actually given money in some way, shape, or form, but he was let off the hook, so that he intermeddled with this. Now, let's take Ms. Meng, for example. You have to coordinate. There are thousands of warrants out, not hundreds, thousands of warrants that are out by the United States. Ms. Meng is coming from China, going through Vancouver, not actually, I don't know the exact circumstances, but going on to Mexico City. It had to have been well coordinated.
Anyway, it was a transit.
Yeah, exactly, it's a transit. And so I'm saying that this would have been well coordinated by Canada. You can't say that they're blameless with regards to this. This was a targeted incident.
So different interpretations here. Although it is perceived that there should be a separation of the administration, the judiciary, and the legislative, but you know, the undertone, I think it is reality. People understand it very well, that in reality you can have the kind of influence. We're going to talk about that when it comes to U.S. President Donald Trump's intention to interfere in this case if he sees the need. But anyway, very quickly, Professor Liu, what are the next challenges that Ms. Meng might be faced with at this moment now that she's out on bail?
Yeah, I know the bail application is approved. I think it's good news. Yeah, they have free at least for some months.
But what's the legal battle ahead?
Yeah, so for bail, I think it's precondition release from the pre-trial detention. So they pay some bail bond.
Correct.
Yeah, if they return the court as request at any time and appeal, so the bond will be returned to Ms. Meng. If they do not, maybe they will be forfeited and charged with the crime of failure to imprises in the court. I think they will do very well. I think next challenge is for extradition. So extradition will be heard maybe 2 months later. Yeah, 2 months later.
Yeah.
So the Mr. Meng and his lawyer will need to prepare well how to argue the refused to extradition. Yeah.
Okay, we'll talk about that in our next show, maybe. We don't have the time here. Many thanks to Professor Liu Guofu from the Beijing Institute of Technology. And you have been watching The Point with me, Li Xin. Stay right here. We'll be back right after this short break to talk about the U.S.-China relations side of this whole saga. Stay with us. Welcome back. In an interview with Reuters on Tuesday, U.S. President Donald Trump said he would intervene in the U.S. Justice Department's case against Meng Wanzhou if it would serve national security interests or help close a trade deal with China. Let's read exactly what he said. He said, "I think it is good for what will certainly be the largest trade deal ever made, which is a very important thing. What's good for national security? I would certainly intervene if I thought it was necessary." So again, my guest here in the studio, Ed Lehman from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. I'm also joined from Washington, D.C. by Ivan Eland, Senior Fellow at the Independent Institute. Let me go to Mr. Eland. How do you read the messages from President Trump that I just quoted? What does it mean? Does it mean that he will intervene when he sees the need is there? Or can he intervene? Does he have the mandate to intervene in a judicial case?
Well, of course, you know, it's hard to say whether she was arrested just by the prosecutors or whether this was coordinated up through the White House. In the United States, the prosecutors in the Justice Department are somewhat independent of the White House.
Somewhat.
However,
you said somewhat. What do you mean, somewhat?
Well, I mean, they're under the executive branch. Technically, they're under the president, but they do have independent prosecutors around the country. Federal prosecutors can arrest people after investigating. So it is alleged that she violated the U.S. sanctions law. And I don't personally agree with that law, but it is a law. So, but certainly President Trump is taking advantage of this to intervene for diplomatic. He could, for diplomatic purposes, do that. And he's certainly using, by announcing that, he's certainly using it as a bargaining chip in the negotiations. So I think we can say that there is some manipulation of this for political purposes, or at least negotiating purposes.
Well, that is, you know, quite unwise to say that in public, because according to the extradition agreement between the U.S. and Canada, there is one possibility that Ms. Meng Wanzhou might be rejected extradition to the United States, exactly because of the possibility that her case might be politically motivated or has a political nature to it. Does President Trump not know what he's supposed to do, what he's not supposed to do, or what he's supposed to say or not to say?
No, I think you're absolutely correct. I think he doesn't really grasp the legal system, and I think that will become apparent internally here soon. But certainly he thinks everything is political, that he can manipulate things. And you're absolutely right. Canada could take advantage of that and say, well, this is going to be a political football, so we're rejecting their extradition request. Now, of course, Canada's economy is closely tied to the U.S., and the U.S. has a lot of influence over Canada. But of course, as your guests previously mentioned, Canada does want to diversify its trade, and China is growing as a world economic power, certainly. And so Canada might have an excuse to find an excuse to not extradite. I predict this is probably going to be solved politically. The whole thing is probably going to be solved eventually.
Okay, Ed, you wanted to say something just now.
Well, certainly, I mean, I think that this is an action that's been done by Canada, which is a sovereign nation. I mean, there are thousands, tens of thousands of indictment and warrants that are issued for any number of people, that this would have been coordinated by the Canadian government. I mean, I would imagine this would have been a pass-through in transit on the way to Mexico, is what the reports were, so that, you know, this was an act that was taken proactively by the Canadians, whether people want to admit it or not. Mr. Trump, you know, is an outspoken person. There's no question about that. He does not have a law degree. I mean, he doesn't make any bones about that.
So there is no credit to what he said, or what does that reflect? The kind of logic that might be in his mind. You know, he just blurted out, maybe.
Well, all things are political. I mean, so I mean, he can take a spin on it in any which way that he wants. And again, he's playing towards his base. Now, it is technically under the executive, but remember that she's being detained by the Canadian at the behest of the Canadian authorities, and I mean, you know, she's on bail, of course, which means that she is out and about. In exchange for the money that's been deposited there. So, you know, America doesn't have control over her or the situation right now unless they withdraw the indictment. Now, there has been, or the warrant, there has been a lot of unclarity with regards to the indictment, and we've seen indictments before by the Department of Justice. This has not been made readily apparent.
Okay. Well, let me talk about the warning that is being debated, Mr. Eland, within the U.S. State Department for its citizens about increased risks when traveling to China. What kind of, do you think the situation is really to such a level that Americans should be warned to travel to China? If so, who should be warned? Who should be, you know, watching out?
Well, the Chinese government does seem to be pretty incensed about this, and I think there's also been some memos floating around Silicon Valley that are saying, you know, if executives of U.S. companies go to China, perhaps they should not go to China and restrict their travel until this is solved. So I think there is some fear that there'll be retaliation on the part of China detaining a U.S. executive similarly. So, and we already see the Canadian who has been detained. So I think countries do play these games, unfortunately, and you know, I think the whole trade war is ridiculous, but I think economics should be kept away from this sort of thing, but of course it's not, and that we live in a real world here. So I think there is some fear in the U.S., both in the government and in U.S. companies that do business in China, that some of the executives may, or at least one executive may be taken as sort of a bargaining chip in this whole brouhaha.
Well, I understand this kind of fear, maybe, whether it is founded or not, but the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs has said that people are welcome to visit China, to travel to China, to do sightseeing, but if they work for an NGO that is not licensed in China, this is against Chinese law. And if you do not have any criminal intention, or you do not carry out criminal activities or break Chinese laws and regulations, there is no danger, right? Mr. Lehman, you have been living in China for so many years. How does this sound to you?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think it's absolutely ludicrous that the State Department has come out with some sort of statement that there's going to be some possibility of executives being arrested. This fellow with the NGO clearly knew or should have known or had willful blindness in some way, shape, or form with regards to how an NGO operates inside China. Like I said, they had even offered all NGOs previously who were registered in China under the old rules for some discussion about whether these rules were going to be correct or not, and so people understood. Yeah. This is not coincidental.
Okay, so yeah, I have very limited time, but there are so many things happening at this moment, right? The U.S. is saying, the Trump administration is saying that they might arrest cyber hackers from China, and then China is lowering the U.S. imported cars tariff to China from 40% to 15%. And then China is also announcing that it will very soon import, well, President Trump is announcing that China is going to import U.S. soybeans very soon. So, Mr. Eland, what are we looking at here? How are you going to describe the next remaining days of the 90-day truce that the two sides have negotiated?
Well, hopefully they'll get an agreement so that we can end the trade war. It's been dragging down world markets, and the international economic forecasters are reducing their projections of growth because of this trade war. And I think we need to end it. And, you know, I think what will happen is Trump will do what he did with the North American Free Trade Agreement. He'll get a face-saving you know, cosmetic change in it, and then we can go back to normal, hopefully. Trump likes to get a win, and he can spin almost anything as a win, so I think that's probably how it will end. There'll be a lot of smoke, and probably in the end, you know, maybe the fire will be put out.
Okay, thank you very much. We have to leave it there. Edward Lehman, Senior Foreign Fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and Ivan Eland, Senior Fellow at the Independent Institute. And that's it for this edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.